Now, every Muslim worth his or her salt knows that interest or riba is haram and a major sin. But in this video, I will cover with you 10 times when interest is actually halal. Some of these are going to shock you. The point of this video is not to say, kullu halal, go ahead and do whatever you like. No, the point of this is much more to reflect on the richness of our tradition and to see that there are multiple perspectives out there, and also examining this whole concept of riba and interest allows us to better understand where the red lines are. And I should caveat that, like most things, when it comes to the Sharia, there are two sides to pretty much every view, and there are scholars who would agree and disagree on each of the 10 things that we cover. Indeed, I disagree with a number of them myself. So with that, let's dive in. So for the first one, let's go for something a little bit niche. There's a hadith in Bukhari and Muslim where Prophet ﷺ allowed for al-Araya up to 653 kilograms. So what is this al-Araya business all about? So in the Prophet's time, people used to trade between dates that were fresh and on a tree and dates that had already fallen and were ripe and they had been picked. Now, Prophet ﷺ at that time in the Sharia, in Islamic law, there's some clear guidance about exchanging items that need to be equal in number. So 100 dates for 100 dates. It doesn't matter if it's a different quality or type of date, it needs to be equal in number to avoid any chance of interest creeping in. Now, the exception was this kind of situation, and al-Araya was allowed up to a minimum threshold. Of course, like everything, there's lots of scholarly debate around what exactly this is, what this means, but the upshot of it is that Prophet ﷺ would make exceptions in certain instances, either if it was due to communal matters or if it was a gifting transaction, or just to make it easy for business people. The second one we're going to discuss is one that we have discussed many times before in this channel. When an Islamic mortgage is not available in a country and due to necessity you are pushed into needing a house, then some scholars would allow you to take out a conventional mortgage and buy a house. That would be an example where due to necessity, interest would be allowed for you in that short window. As I've shared many times on this channel, my personal view is that certainly for the UK, that ruling really shouldn't apply because we have Islamic home financing options available. However, if you live in a country where no Islamic finance options are available, then this rukhsa, this leniency, may be relevant for you. If in doubt, always ask a local scholar. The third situation is car finance. So with car finance, what is actually happening with PCP, PCH, HP contracts is it will say on the document, you, Ibrahim Khan, are paying interest on this car finance agreement. However, when you boil down and you look into the contract, you don't actually own the car. The finance company owns the car and it is effectively leasing it to you. And so even though it says what you are paying is interest, we would understand it, or many scholars would understand that as a rental payment and therefore permissible. So in this situation, interest is actually halal because it is not interest in the way that the Sharia would understand it to be. As ever, the devil is always in the details, so make sure that you read your contract carefully. I haven't reviewed all the contracts in the entire world, so I'm sure there will be some out there that are not permissible. Situation number 4, penalty clauses. So what happens if you stop paying your Islamic bank your monthly payments that you have to pay the Islamic bank? Ultimately, the Islamic bank will say that you need to pay that money up. And usually, if it wasn't an Islamic bank, the bank would charge interest on top of that as a bit of a penalty for the delay that you have caused. But an Islamic bank is not allowed to do that, as that would be deemed as interest. So instead, what an Islamic bank has to do is they still charge that amount of money because they don't want you to get off scot-free. They don't want to create what is called moral hazard. They don't want to create a situation where you have no incentive to actually pay on time. But at the same time, when they get that penalty payment, they are required under the regulations and laws that their Sharia board has set to give away all of that money to charity and don't benefit from that whatsoever. So that would be a situation where the taking of interest is deemed permissible by scholars, however the consuming of it isn't, and you have to donate that away. Situation number 5, all of us pretty much have a bank account. But what most of us won't realize is that a bank account is actually you as an individual agreeing to lend the bank money, which the bank has decided to use however it sees fit. And on the bank side, it has a responsibility that if you make a demand for it, for your deposit back, then it gives you that money back whenever you ask for it via the ATM machine. That's actually what the transaction is all about if you read the terms and conditions. So when you are entering into a bank account agreement, what you are agreeing to is, HSBC, please pay me interest regularly for the use of my money. That, of course, is haram. But scholars in today's day and age, just because this is the system that we live in and without a bank account, we really can't function, scholars, of course, allow this. What they say is, rather than taking the interest and using it, you take the interest and you donate that away. Situation number 6, credit cards. Now, with a credit card, the situation is slightly the opposite. Here, your credit card company is lending you money for a short period of time, and then ultimately, if you don't pay that up in time, the credit card company starts charging interest on that. So when you enter into that transaction, you are agreeing, credit card company, if I mess up, I will pay you interest on this amount of money. And if you enter into this transaction and you have no intention of ever actually falling into that overdue period and being charged interest, then many scholars would allow that because you aren't technically activating those clauses of the agreement that have interest associated with it. So there you have another transaction where you have technically signed a document that says you will be bound by interest-bearing loans. However, you are not directly activating any of those. Situation number 7, student loans. There are many scholars out there who would allow a Muslim student to take out a student loan if there are no halal alternatives available for that student. And there are other scholars that would allow student loans because many student loans, like right now in the UK, they are linked to the inflation rate. And so the interest is actually not really an increase on the money, these scholars would argue, but simply a way to pay back and keep to parity the value of the money that you borrowed in the first place. And so this group of scholars would argue is not actually true interest. So this would be another situation where you are technically paying interest, but it is not actually deemed interest. Or if you follow the first view, you are paying interest, but it is just allowed because of necessity. Of course, this is one of those situations where me personally, I would avoid taking that loan out as much as humanly possible unless you were really, really struggling. Situation number 8 is another really interesting hadith that was narrated by Aisha radiallahu anha, who asked the Prophet ﷺ that, look, people borrow yeast and bread from their neighbors. So when they return it, if it's more or less, is that permissible? And the Prophet ﷺ said something really interesting. He said, there's absolutely no harm in it. It is a common practice of the people, and the increase or decrease is not what they intend. Then in another narration, we hear the Prophet ﷺ said, so take the larger amount and give the smaller, or take the smaller and give the bigger. The best amongst you is the one who is best in paying back his debts. So what do we understand from that situation? So if you are lending something from your neighbor and you give back a little bit more, give back a little bit less, that is okay. Why is that okay? Well, it's okay because this is not really seen as a business transaction. This is just you helping out a neighbor, right? The whole situation is very different. And in fact, it is better perhaps to even construe this as a gift type scenario. Why would the Prophet ﷺ say that, you should be the one that gives back more rather than less? It's again because of that idea of they have gifted you something rather than lent you something, and you are gifting them something back. And this is something that we, of course, as Muslims should learn from and adhere to. Situation number 9. There are many Islamic scholars, and this is a view in the Hanafi school, that would allow you to work in the non-riba linked elements within a bank, for example. And the argument goes that as long as you are not with your own hand directly involved in the haram activity, even though you might be in some way somehow connected to supporting the activity, that would be okay. Now, these scholars, most of them would still encourage you to look for an alternative job that didn't have any ambiguity around it whatsoever, but technically they would allow one to work in a bank that deals in interest. Now, of course, my own view, if I was advising my brother from a taqwa perspective, and also I think to some extent from a fiqh perspective, would be to not necessarily adhere to such a view and say that, look, if you can avoid it, then sure, this is the lenient view, but if you can avoid it, then try and avoid it and work for some other profession if you can. Situation number 10, you've got someone who comes into your corner shop. He's a CEO of Goldman Sachs, made an absolute ton of money from lending money, from selling debts, all of the interest-based transactions you can think of under the world. And he comes in and he buys a Mars bar. Can you take his money or not? Isn't that interest money, entirely interest-based money that he is giving you for that Mars bar? And the answer is, ladies and gentlemen, that you can take his money. And the reason why you can take his money is because the Sharia doesn't require you to examine each and every person's personal finances and how they earned their money and where all of that came from. Sure, if you are selling grapes to someone that you know to be a wine merchant and that is your sole business, which is the selling of grapes to wine merchants, that becomes potentially problematic. However, if you're just in the business of selling stuff and some people are paying for that using money that is perhaps not completely halal, or some people are using that Mars bar or grape or whatever it is for haram purposes, that's not on you. So folks, there we are. We went through 10 different examples pretty quickly. As I said at the start, this is not a fatwa. These are not scholarly breakdowns of the entire thing from both the for and against and giving all the different fiqh perspectives and then applying it to your particular context. That is not what this video is about. So please don't take it as such. Don't use this as a fatwa. These are conversations to deepen our understanding of the fabric of the Sharia. So I would invite you to treat it as such. For me, what I took away from these 10 examples when I was putting them together was firstly, that necessity and haja can sometimes allow for something that the Sharia would otherwise not allow as permissible. The second thing that I took away that I found really interesting was that the social and communal aspect around certain transactions can really make a difference on how it is treated, if it is seen as interest or not, and how much of a leniency there is around it. And then the final thing that I took away from this analysis was that contracts and what they say on the paper is not actually what matters. It is what is the substance behind them that really, really matters. So those were my take homes. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. What were your take homes? And if there's any particular scenarios that I gave that you'd like me to do a further video on, then please let me know in the comments below. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.